Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Maria. I'm the program's assistant, and we are very happy to have Pamela Moses with us here today. She's going to talk about her new book, The Appetites of Girls. So without further ado, please welcome Pamela.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Elm Street Books for arranging this evening and for the New Canaan Library for hosting me. I am so happy to be here. I'll give just a little bit of background about the book and then read a few pages from the book itself. The Appetites of Girls follows the stories of 4 college suitemates of various backgrounds. They are Ruth, Opal, Francesca, and Setsu. Each of these friends is struggling to find her true self and the courage to claim what will make her whole. Throughout the majority of the book, these friends are young adults, but the book opens with each of their girlhood stories because it is in girlhood or adolescence that their appetites for food, for love, for attention, or for approval first take hold. And it's in childhood as well that, as a result of their earliest experiences or relationships, or even certain tendencies that are born inside them, that they begin to doubt themselves, to doubt their abilities, even their own value. And so the journey for each of these friends as she begins to make her way into the world is to learn that though she may have been knocked down by life circumstances or even by her own misguided choices, that the truest part of her is the part that is strong, strong enough to overcome what has damaged her, strong enough to be whole and to claim her dreams. And so what I would like to read this evening are a few pages from Setsu's story. Setsu was adopted at a very young age from an orphanage in Japan. She is a gifted violinist, but where we find her at this point in the book, by this point in the book, she has put aside her music. She has given up music, in large part because she has an older brother, Toru, also a violinist, who is very jealous of Setsu and extremely jealous of her musical gifts, and who, through a series of manipulations, has caused her to doubt her own abilities. Where we find her now, she has gone off to college, to Brown University, and is sharing a suite of rooms with Francesca and with Opal and with Ruth. She has begun dating a graduate student named James, who is a few years older than she is. James lavishes her with praise and with attention in a way no one has before, especially for her delicate appetite and her petite figure. So that Setsu, who has always been very careful about how she eats, restricts herself even more, and denies herself even more food, denies herself more food, or denies herself in her diet even more. She and James begin to spend increasingly more time together, and James seems always to need more and more of Setsu for himself, to the point that she finds she has less and less time for her friends, is struggling to make time for her studies, and has not even given a thought to returning to music. In this particular scene, Setsu and James have met Francesca and some mutual friends for brunch at a country club outside of Providence. And during the course of the brunch, Setsu reveals to Francesca and to another woman at the table what she has not yet been able to share with her suitemates or even with James. She tells of her years of playing the violin and of how music had seemed to live in her once, of how there had been a time she could not imagine it no longer would. Francesca, upon hearing this, becomes very excited. She is thrilled that Setsu has this talent, and she tells her she can't give up what has been so deeply a part of her life. She must find some way to return to it. Francesca wrapped her box of parliaments excitedly against her palm. "Doesn't James beg you to play? He must." Leaning forward, reaching for a pitcher of pineapple juice at the center of the table, she interrupted James's conversation with Dominic. "Why did you let your girlfriend keep such a secret from us?" she said, with a ringing of her bracelets. "I had no idea she was a real musician." "You must encourage her. Tell her she mustn't waste her gift." From the stiffening of James's jaw, I knew I had made a mistake by confessing things to Francesca I had never shared with him. "I know, she's wonderful, isn't she?" He reached for my hand, clasping it in his, but before he did so, I thought I saw a flickering as his eyes shifted from Francesca to me, a darkness, something unfamiliar. Returning to Providence, James chose the most direct route rather than the quieter one along the river we had followed on our way to the Hill Club. Few cars were on the road, and there was little sound but the whirring of his tires on the paved highway. Each time James adjusted his legs or cleared his throat, I prepared for him to mention the revelation Fran had made. But for many, many miles, his only comments were about a crow we spotted perched atop a decaying tree and the gathering clouds overhead. So I was left to my own thoughts, and my mind began to wander, to dream of unlikely things, of old abandoned hopes. And when I could no longer bear the suspense of trying to guess James's opinion, I blurted the question that had been aching in my throat since leaving the club. "Some students from the music department were starting their own chamber ensemble," I explained. "Last week I had seen their posters near the campus mailboxes. They needed a violinist, and auditions would be in the spring. I didn't really consider it until now, until Fran. Do you think it would be silly of me, with just a few months to prepare?" James's eyes narrowed without blinking, puckering the skin between his brows as if he were focusing hard on some object in the road. For a time he said nothing, and I felt the blood rush to my ears, certain that James was about to point out the irrationality of my suggestion. But when he finally turned to me, it was with the half-smile he saved for our most private moments. No, of course he did not think me silly. It was only that he had some concerns, he said, petting my forehead, running his fingers through strands of my hair. Wasn't my schedule full enough already? Hadn't he heard me complain that I was beginning to fall behind in my Chaucer reading, that I had needed an extension for my most recent Dickens paper? "I just don't want you to feel overloaded," he said. And as I nodded, he peered at me intently, then lifted my wrist to his lips. James was right, I was quite sure. It was probably unreasonable to think I could manage another demand on my time. For a day or two, I tried to forget my conversation with Francesca and Fiona and any foolish notions about joining the chamber ensemble. Francesca could talk of independence and daring, of living life with courage, but of course these things came easily to her. Things one could not fake or pretend, and I did not know if they could be learned. But then memories began to disturb my nights. I would wake in the dark to the sound of a Mozart symphony or a Beethoven sonata, only to realize the music was playing in my own head. Beautiful sections of pieces, the notes clear as crystals, as if I'd practiced them just the day before. One night, I was startled from sleep by a dream I had not dreamed since early girlhood. I am in Japan, never having been taken to America. I'm sitting on a stone bench in a small garden with my birth mother, who is alive and well. She is playing the solo part of Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E on an instrument with wood that shines gold brown in the sunlight. When she finishes, she bends her head to kiss my cheek, then smiling passes the violin to me, waiting for me to play with notes as strong and clear as hers. Lying in James's bed, having woken from my dream, I stared at the ceiling, at the faint shadows of tapering tree branches, and brushed at the tears that slipped silently from the corners of my eyes. So the following morning, I unpacked from beneath my dormitory bed the violin and stack of sheet music I had decided at the last minute to bring back with me to Brown. For the first few days, unsure of how I would sound, not wanting to humiliate myself, I only risked practice in private, in the solitude of my room if my suite mates were out, or in one of the music department's soundproof cubicles. To my surprise, fingerings and bowings returned more quickly than I had anticipated. For my audition piece, I selected a section of Tartini's Sonata in G minor. I began to play every spare moment, and though uncertain if my sound had the precision, the style, the fire necessary to be chosen, I soon felt glimmers of hope. For some reason, my time on the violin seemed to make my appetite grow. Often, after an hour or two of practicing, I discovered I was starved. From the snack bars on campus, I would buy cheese-filled calzones, plates of fried falafel, bowls of sesame noodles, savoring each bite, scraping every last crumb. And though I intended to repent later, to restrict my diet as I had done before, I found myself too ravenous at each meal for such discipline. As I grew more careless in my eating, I became also less particular about where I practiced. After the hesitation of the first week or two had worn off, I dared to play in one of the larger common areas of the music department if the individual cubicles were taken, or even, on occasion, at James's apartment before he returned home. So one early evening, when I discovered him leaning in the doorway, his thumbs tucked into his belt loops, silently watching me, the bow faltered in my hand, and I lost my place on my page of music. "I've decided to try out after all," I laughed, feeling warmth rise to my face. My hands shook, but to my surprise, I heard a confidence in my voice. I believed I had sounded as definite as Francesca would have. For a moment, James did not respond. He was chewing the inside of his cheek in concentration and seemed to be mulling over some private thought. "Sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you." He nodded with unusual formality, then disappeared down the hall to the kitchen, leaving me gripping the violin neck, the bow dangling from my other hand. I could hear him loudly dropping cubes of ice into a glass. That night, throughout dinner, and later curled beside him in bed, I waited for James to mention my playing, to give some small hint of approval or dismay, but he made no allusion to it, as if he'd forgotten what he'd seen and heard. The following day he came down with a cold. His eyes swelled, the skin around his nostrils reddened. He was too ill to attend classes, and I should have offered soup or company, asked what he needed. But every time he blew into his plaid handkerchief, I felt only irritation. Of course he had his own concerns, but I could not help noticing that as he recovered, the violin case which I had stowed in the corner beside his bedroom chair, where I kept my coat and textbooks and a spare change of clothes, continued to go unmentioned. As I practiced, though, certainly strains of music must have reached where he lay in bed. So once he was well enough to go out, I could not stop myself, as I played, from listening for James's returning footsteps on the veranda. Once or twice I thought I recognized the familiar thud of his feet, then a long pause before his hand turned the doorknob, bringing in a rush of icy outdoor air. But still I waited, and still he said nothing. "Men are so insensitive," my suite mate sometimes complained, especially after the parties Fran occasionally convinced Ruth and Opal to attend with her. And always I had contradicted with stories of James's thoughtfulness. But what would they say of this? And I supposed, if I chose, I had every right to tell them. With just 2 months until the audition, I continued to practice the tartini whenever I could find the time. But now I began to fear that my optimism of the past weeks had been hasty. There were tricky spots where I thought I caught mistakes in my rhythm, notes that needed more vibrato, phrases that required faster bowings. And soon, though I knew James was no musician, though I knew the impossibility of such a thing, I could not help feeling that somehow he too detected flaws in my playing, as Toru once had, that this all along had been the reason for his silence. One afternoon, returning from a practice session, I found Francesca, Ruth, and Opal at home, sprawled on the floor of the common room, sections of the Brown Daily Herald open before them. Their textbooks and class notes lay piled on the coffee table, the favored spot for any deferred work. And since they seemed to be reading only absent-mindedly, I confided my worries. Ruth put her section of the paper aside, reaching out her hand, placing it on mine. "I'm so glad you're using your talent again, Setsu. It's incredible. Really, I wish I had a gift like that. But it's been such a long time since I've played." Francesca stopped reading. For a moment she gazed at me, the corners of her mouth curving almost indiscernibly, her brows lifted ever so slightly. It was an expression she wore when someone contradicted her with an argument she found persuasive. Perhaps she had not truly believed I would try out, but I could see she was pleased I had. "Just stay focused, Setsu. Don't get distracted. If you really want this—" Francesca stopped for a moment. "You do really want it, don't you, Setsu?" "Yes, of course. It's only, well, I don't think James—" James? What does this have to do with James? The forcefulness of Francesca's tone startled me, and I caught Opal glancing at Fran. But they were wrong. James would understand once he knew what it meant to me. Still, for the rest of the day, I thought of what Francesca had said. For some reason, it made me feel quarrelsome, though with whom I was not quite sure. I began to wake early in the mornings to play before my first class. I practiced during the late afternoons while James was teaching. And with this more strenuous work, many nights I found too many thoughts sparked through my mind for sleep. Auditions were on a Saturday. James had some research to do at the science library and had left early before I had wakened. Other mornings when he'd done so, he had placed a romantic note or a blossom from his potted violets on the pillow where he'd slept. I had not mentioned the chamber ensemble tryouts since first telling him of them weeks before, but somehow I had expected him on this morning especially to leave reminders or good luck wishes. I tossed off my blankets, neglecting for once to smooth the sheets and coverlet, to arrange the pillows as James liked. On James's kitchen counter, I found a thin paper bag filled with croissants and sugared donuts, and on a shelf in the back of the refrigerator, 3 kinds of marmalade and a brick of butter wrapped in gold foil. I gobbled part of a donut, an entire croissant, then removed a second from the bag, slathering it with preserves and leaving it on a sheet of paper towel, knowing that 30 minutes into my practicing, I would crave more. I calculated that I had an hour and a half to warm up and run through the tartini before heading to campus to Grant Recital Hall where auditions would be held. Perhaps it was my excitement, perhaps with the nervous thumping of my heart I could not hear the imperfections, but as I played the piece once and then twice, I could not help pressing my lips with expectation. But in my enthusiasm, I must have been deaf too to the tramp of James's steps on the front porch, to the heave of the door and the clip of his heels against the floorboards on his way to the kitchen, and then back to the living room where I was playing. Setsu? I was startled not only by his presence, but by the strangeness of his voice, tensed and hushed as though something had frightened him. Slowly, he seated himself on the long living room sofa, then extended an arm, motioning for me to join him. It was only that he was worried for me, he said. He had seen in the kitchen the evidence of my breakfast, and though he hadn't mentioned it, 2 days ago, unable to find his apartment key and searching my trench coat for the spare, he had discovered a handful of egg roll wrappers and crumpled empty bags of fried noodles. This is not you, Setsu, is it? I hardly recognize the way you are eating. I bowed my head and stared at my stockinged knees and my violin, which I had laid across my lap. For days, I had imagined how, if necessary, I would defend my decision to James, but now I could think only of how humiliated I was by his discovery and by the disappointment I had heard in the way he spoke my name. You've just taken on more than you can handle, yes? He said, pinching his chin between his forefinger and thumb. It's nerves, don't you think? No, I believe I'm really fine. But you are planning to audition after all, on top of everything else? Maybe you should take a break, Or, he paused for some moments. Maybe it's this that you don't want. To my horror, he made a small semicircle in the air with his hand, gesturing to himself and then to me. Life doesn't allow us time for everything, does it? You have to prioritize. You must make choices. It is too painful for me to have you in fragments, Setsu. He straightened in his seat, slowly turning his head so that his profile was to me. From this angle, I could see the nearly imperceptible shiftings of his rain-gray eyes, the slight narrowing of his lids, and I knew, as a coldness like frigid water passed through me, he was considering other choices. No, you won't have me in pieces. You will have all of me. It's what I want too. And it was. As I placed my violin down on the couch cushion, James beamed at me, then began tenderly to kiss my cheeks and chin and mouth. All I wish for is your happiness, he said, as he stroked my brow, wound a wisp of my hair around his finger. I hope you know that. It hurts me to see you so burdened. He leaned over to caress my neck behind my ear. How deeply James cared for me. How wisely. It seemed he knew me better than Ruth or Francesca or Opal, even better than I knew myself. How wrong Opal had been in her concerns, and Fran in her dismissiveness. I belonged to him, and he to me. It was what I needed, more than anything, more than claiming some part of myself, as Francesca had said. And because of their influence, I had nearly lost him by not accepting who I was, who I had to be. I was blessed, yes, truly blessed, because James loved me in ways my sweet mates could never understand. Only he had seen that over the last several days I had been different, not felt my old self at all. Glancing at my watch, I saw that the audition would begin without me in less than 20 minutes, but there was no reason for sadness, was there? No reason for these tears brimming at the corners of my eyes. For what was I sacrificing? It was not that I had ever been found to be a significant violinist. It was only for fun I had decided to try out. Only a few months of time I had dedicated to practicing. So it was a matter of small consequence. After all, I was not Toru. James massaged my right shoulder. Why don't we get away for the day? I know a beautiful drive along the shoreline. The weather should be mild enough for a picnic lunch. He had bought chicken salad the night before. With the leftovers, he could make sandwiches, he said. How does that sound? Yes, lovely, I nodded. And sweet girl, I nearly forgot. I bought you something when I was downtown yesterday, something only you could do justice to. He kissed the tip of my nose, then rose from the sofa. He returned with a red rectangular cardboard box tied with a gauzy white ribbon. I'm going to the kitchen. He leaned close so that his mustache tickled my bare neck. Maybe you could surprise me when I come back. Wear this, he whispered, until we leave. I could hear James in the kitchen removing dishes and utensils from cupboards. I crossed the living room to gaze out the window. Outside on Benefit Street, clusters of students, their cheeks rosy from the still cool spring air, were hurrying to one place or another. A brown lacrosse game, friends' dorms, a late breakfast at the Ratty. After a time, a solitary girl with braided hair in knee socks and carrying a pennant that I recognized from one of the neighborhood middle schools was singing in a clear, pretty voice, the Danube Waltz. It was part of a collection of Strauss waltzes my parents had played again and again when I was young. How beautiful I had thought the piece. I could remember standing motionlessly before the record player, humming, trying to make my voice swell and recede to follow the cadence. I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching the girl as she moved down the sidewalk, straining to hear the notes until they faded and then finally died. My gift was a filmy pink negligee and matching robe. Extra, extra small, read its label, and I had to work some minutes to fit into it properly. Countless tiny silk ribbons wound the nightgown's bodice, wrapping me like a spool of thread. At the slightest inhalation, my ribs ached, but James would think it perfect. I could see that in my reflection in the window pane. When he saw me, he would say something generous, something admiring. James had prepared sandwiches. He had crackers, a wedge of cheese, fruit salad. How much would I eat? He called from the kitchen. Exactly what should he pack for me? Oh, just a half sandwich, thank you. I breathed carefully, shallowly in my gown and robe. A half sandwich and maybe a little fruit salad. Yes, that would be plenty. That was all I needed. Okay, and I'll stop there. Okay, so if anyone has questions, let me know.
Are you a musician?
I am not. I did play the violin for a number of years, but I was not nearly as gifted as Setsu. I played on and off from third grade all through high school, but so I know a little something about the violin, but I did have to do some research to write her character convincingly because she has talent far beyond what I do.
And how did you come up with the characters and their personalities, and was through your experiences or other friends, I assume, or other people, maybe a compilation of
A compilation, I would say. I mean, there is a piece of me in each of the four main characters, and pieces of people I know. No one of the characters is based on one particular person. But a piece of me and then pieces of people I know. But when I was figuring out the structure of the book and the plot, I tried to come up with characters who were very different from each other. So, I tried to give them very different backgrounds, economically, socially, in as many ways as I could. Because what I wanted to say was that although they are very different from each other, they share a common struggle. And it's the struggle to overcome something self-destructive in themselves, something self-destructive within, and learning to overcome that and find strength and who they are meant to be. So as different as they are, that's something they share. And I think it's, somewhat a universal thing.
Why did you choose Brown?
I went to Brown, in part. Although I have to say, when I first wrote the book, it was a fictional college, although I based it sort of loosely on Brown. And then my editor said, I think is this based on Brown? I think you should make it actually Brown. It will be more convincing. So then as I was editing, I went back through and added very, specific details about of the Brown campus and experience. But yes, because I went there, is the basic answer.
Sounds good. I want to read it.
Do you
Thank you.
write the chapters like from one character's perspective? Is that how the book is
Yes.
set
So
up?
each character is told. Each story is told through that character's voice, and each story is in first person. So. And then the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section being their girlhood stories. The second section being their time together at college, and then the third section being their time as young adults, sort of finding their way out in the world. So in each of those 3 sections, each character tells her story. Yes?
The sequel?
A few people have asked me that, but I think I'm ready to move on to other characters. As much as I love them, I think I need to live with new characters for a while. So, maybe someday.
What was your writing process, and about how long did it take you to write this book?
It took me forever because I started the book when my children were very, very young, babies. So the first draft took about 3 years. And then I spent probably a year editing on my own. I then found an agent and did some edits with him, sort of on and off, and that took another year. Not that I was writing solidly. Most of that time I was not writing, but waiting for feedback from him, and then, so it was quite a bit of back and forth for about a year, and then found my publisher and editor and spent the better part of a year rewriting with her suggestions in mind. So years. It took a long time.
A lot of persistence.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.